Hey, listeners, welcome back to the ValueHunt podcast. And today I'm really excited to be here with Daniel. He's a new host for the Intrinsic Value podcast, which is also part of the Investors Podcast Network. And obviously, we are all familiar with that, so no need for introductions. And yeah, Daniel, why don't you say a couple of words before we jump into the questions?
Well, thanks for the kind intro. Um, yeah, I'm quite a young investor as well. I think we both are. I just started working with the Investors podcast and now on this new journey for the Intrinsic Value podcast. And I hope it will be as good as people hope. I think the standard is pretty high at the Investors podcast, but I have a great colleague and it's a phenomenal team. So I'm pretty sure we will have a fantastic journey together.
Yeah, sure. And shout out to Sean. He was like probably one of my first five guests in the show. So it's yeah, it's cool to have you have the chance to talk with people like you. So my first question is actually a bit more on your childhood and background because I feel like you're very young, and so something must have happened when you were young that yeah, propelled you into going to finance and investing and all that. So maybe you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, I think my childhood was pretty ordinary. It's not like,
Okay.
I mean, we all know these stories about Buffett. I think his father was a stockbroker, and I think that's
Yeah.
quite often the case with many of these, especially older investors. That
Hmm.
hasn't been the case in my family at all. My father wasn't a stockbroker. My mother wasn't either. It's more so that investing in stocks was in my family probably seen as gambling. I
Okay.
think it's generally a cultural difference between maybe the US and then European countries. I think you know that as well. So stock investing is not that big, but I think there's this like a change in the perception of investing in stocks in our generation. I think it has come a lot more, or we have evolved a lot more, and a lot more people are investing. So I wouldn't say there's like a specific point in my childhood where investing has suddenly become or played a role or anything. It was
Hmm.
more like, I mean, I think you have to have um, a certain fascination with money in general. And then you have
Hmm.
this naive thought of making money just by investing instead of working, which always sounds good. And if you're a kid, that's probably like, I don't know, it's just fascinating to you. And it was the same
Yeah.
for me. So I couldn't say that there was like a certain point where stock investing became a big thing. It was more like a natural evolution, I would say.
Hmm. Okay, okay, makes sense. And so, uh, like maybe making the bridge between your childhood and like pretty regular childhood from where what you're telling. So how that became into like what you're doing now with also your Substack, your blog, and you also have a pretty huge Twitter account or X. So maybe you could make the bridge because for now we just know you're a regular kid and you like money or something. So
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
So I started out with Twitter, or now X, but back then it was called Twitter. And I basically just had the idea that I would share what I learn, also to
Hmm.
discuss it with other people, because you know it best if you start out in investing and maybe you do not have the background that other people have. It's just best to discuss ideas, to see what other people think. There's not a better place to do that than social media. And especially back then it was Twitter. I think now there are some other platforms that might be good for that as well. So I just started sharing what I learned, and I read a lot of books, like a lot of books, especially on investing
Hmm.
philosophy in the beginning. And I just started posting about it, and that's how Twitter grew. And then at some point, maybe we'll talk about that more later on, but at some point you kind of hit a plateau if you only learn about investing philosophy. So I thought
Hmm.
it would be good if I get more practical experience in, and Twitter's a good place for sharing investing philosophy and all that stuff. But if you actually want to start investing and sharing ideas, it's good to have something like a blog, something where you can post more than, I don't know, how many words can you type into Twitter?
I
I
think
think
when I don't know, to be honest. Sorry.
it's not a lot though. So I thought maybe a longer form post would be great, and that's why I started my blog then. So that's how I went to Twitter first, and then went on to starting a blog as well.
Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, that feels like a natural kind of progression. And so, my next question is actually a bit more personal for me or selfish, because a lot of people have told me that I should do more general type content because obviously you have more people that are interested in it. But I wanted to ask you, how do you balance between delivering like high quality content that is high value and high information, but also cater to a more to a broader audience? Because obviously, if people don't know, you have like more than 100,000 followers on X, and like also a lot of subscribers on your Substack. So how have you managed that kind of dilemma?
Well, because it's a journey of growing, it's something that you probably always ask yourself too late. And
Hmm.
in my opinion, Twitter just kind of grew very fast. So I didn't really think about how exactly I would handle it. And then I used my blog to, as I said, get more practical, but also filter it down a bit to the people who actually want to learn about how
Hmm.
to invest and not only investing in terms of
Hmm.
philosophy. So it was also kind of natural. In general, I would say, because you asked for advice, basically, if I can give advice, I would say that you have to have a long term goal in mind. And
Hmm.
by that I mean, I think you also interviewed some investors who are more into the micro and small cap space. And
Yeah.
generally, if that's the case, your following will be smaller, but you will have people who are a lot more engaged with your content because they are investing in a small niche as well. And so there's a lot more to discuss. And maybe it's something like a decision that you have to take where you say, do I want to reach as many people as possible? Or do I want to have a smaller and an engaged circle of people who are like-minded investors? And
Mm.
it's always a kind of trade-off. And I mean, with your podcast, I would say you probably go into the direction of having maybe a bit of a smaller circle, but people who are really
Mhm.
into the industry and into investing deeply. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's something you have to decide yourself.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. But I was also kind of interested in knowing more about how you made that decision for you. So, for example, in my case, as you said, my goal is to really become an investor. Therefore, I'm just talking with the people I feel that are interesting, and those people happen to be in the microcap space. So, I guess that's like a smaller circle. But
Mhm.
what's your circle? What are you trying to target, or what were you trying to target back then?
Well, back
Yes.
then, I would definitely say I went for reach mostly. I
Hmm.
thought the bigger the following, the better it is. And it does come with advantages. But since this is an investing podcast, I think no one would ask my or would not know the term competitive advantages. And
Hmm.
it is a competitive advantage if you have a small and engaged circle because
Hmm.
building a huge following nowadays is not that difficult anymore. It takes
Yeah.
time and it takes consistency. But especially if you're an ex, um, a lot of people, and I've realized that myself, they will just copy your content, for example, and post it themselves. And there's nothing
Yeah.
you can do about it because there is no competitive advantage, right? If you
Yeah. Yeah.
create good content, then you will grow, but other people will just, they can copy it or they can use it themselves. So there's not much that you can do about that. And if you have a community with like minded people who actually discuss a lot with you, this personal connection is your competitive advantage. And that's kind of what I focused more on in probably the recent year, I would say, that you get a community where you can share ideas and those discussions with the people that enable like actual personal connections, they are your competitive advantage. And I think that's the right decision to, at least for me, it was. And I think for most people, it would be to go into that direction if they use social media in a way to boost their business, but also learn from it, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, makes a ton of sense. And so, tell us all about the Intrinsic Value podcast, because honestly, I knew the Millennial Investing podcast, and I guess this is kind of a rebranding. So, curious to know what are the plans there, and yeah, obviously you also are co-hosting it with Sean. So, how will you structure the podcast?
Well, first of all, it's correct. It's kind of like a rebranding of the old show. And I think it's a podcast idea that I would have loved to have myself a couple of years
Hmm.
ago. So I think it's a great idea. What we do is that we take a company and we research it and we analyze the business. And most importantly, we value it. And we do
Mm.
one company per week. So you get a newsletter as well as a podcast episode every week where we analyze a business. The newsletter will be a shorter pitch, maybe about 5 minutes to read, while the podcast will be a deep dive where we actually go like 50 minutes, 60 minutes deep into the business. We analyze its history, the business model, competitive advantages, like we just talked about, and then we value it. So we actually want to go a step further than I think most people do, where they just talk about the business, but then at the end, there's not like a tangible price that they give it, where they say this is the
Yeah.
fair value of the business. And that's what we're trying to do.
Mm.
If you would have to break it down, maybe you could say that the idea is that we take the first 20 to 40 hours of research that it would take, and we try to put all of that into a 1 hour episode. And that's basically the idea. And on top of that, we're building a portfolio. I don't know if you've heard about that or if Sean talked about it, but
Mm.
yeah, the idea is that we have all these companies researched and we take the best ideas and then we build a portfolio out of it, which is called the intrinsic value portfolio. And I think the great part about this is that usually when you see the portfolios of other investors, you see a finished product, right? So maybe you see a portfolio where they have Apple, Microsoft, and Google, and you would not know how well they actually perform. They could have bought those stocks last year and then they would probably be down today. And they could have invested in them for 15 years. You do not actually know how they got to that point, right?
Yeah.
So what we are doing is we're building a portfolio in real time for everyone to follow. So I think that's at least from my perspective, it's incredibly helpful for investors who just start out learning about investing, as well as for investors who are in the business for years themselves.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great value proposition, and honestly, I tried to do that a bit with video, but I learned, yeah, it took a lot of work to actually produce the video and all that. So, yeah, happy that you guys are going to do it, and wishing you the best of luck with that.
Thank you.
Um, and I guess you'll also learn a ton because just by researching, doing a deep dive per week,
Sure.
that will be great. Like I think a lot of people would like to be in your position in this moment.
I mean, part of why I joined is that if you do something by yourself, you're just limited by time, right? And
Mhm.
investing is about curiosity. It's about keep learning every day, basically, and getting into businesses or researching businesses on a relatively deep level. I mean, if you put in 40 hours of research into a stock, you do not know everything, but you have quite a good understanding of the company. And at least for me, maybe it's a bit nerdy, but it sounds like the best time, the best use of my time to just go deep into
Mhm.
businesses, learn about one business and industry this week, and about another business, another industry the next week, and it's phenomenal. And if you do everything by on your own, like I did with my blog, with Twitter, and also simultaneously to studying, it just keeps being so much that I felt the best value proposition for my readers and as well as for myself would be to join TIP and get all of the resources, the smart people I can discuss with, and that's why I kind of made the decision.
Yeah, yeah, that's great, man. Happy for you. And yeah, going back to you mentioned studying, so going back a bit to the time where you were doing this on your own, like how are you balancing everything out? Because you were studying, you at some point when we started talking, you were discussing your thesis, and then also having to kind of post all these good content for your audience. So I'm curious to know what kind of prioritization or time management techniques or how whatever strategies you use to make that happen. I guess.
Well, I wish I could tell you now that I have some perfect strategies in place that took me through all the work that I
Mm.
had to put in. But I think the most important part is passion, because if
Mhm.
if you study and you do all the other things on the side, then it has to be kind of your hobby, because it will be so
Yeah,
much
yeah,
time that you spend on it. If it actually feels like work, then you will not be able to do it. So it has to kind of be your hobby. And then apart from that, you still have to make trade-offs and decisions. For example,
Mm,
if I mean, what I didn't do is I posted less content when the exams were actually coming up, like
mm.
in 2 to 3 weeks before the exams, I posted less content. But apart from that, I tried to keep a regular schedule. And it's a game of trade-offs where sometimes you have to decide maybe you study a bit less. I do not want to give you some bad tips now, but sometimes you may decide to study a bit less and focus on some research more. And it's like I said, it's a game of trade-offs, and it's always difficult to assess what's like the right balance, and you kind of have to decide it for yourself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And I really resonate with that part of making it your. I mean, it has to be your hobby, right? So your passion. Cool. So since I know you've studied a lot of history's best investors and thinkers and all that, I have some quotes for you, and I would like you to kind of give your thoughts on those quotes or personal anecdotes or experiences you feel are relevant to those quotes, and
Sure.
maybe also telling if you agree or disagree, whatever. So I'll read the first quote, and it is from Charlie Munger. We are all learning, modifying, or destroying ideas at all the time. Rapid destruction of your ideas when the time is right is one of the most valuable qualities you can acquire. You must force yourself to consider arguments on the other side.
Well, first of all, I would say I totally agree with this one. First, I thought you would get another one from manga, which is, I don't know if you know that one. It goes something like, any year that you don't destroy one of your most beloved ideas is a wasted year. And that's one of
Yeah,
the few. Do you know that one?
yeah,
Yeah, and it's one of the few quotes by manga, I would say, where I do not totally agree, because I feel like
mhm,
there's definitely the need, as in this quote, to learn and to modify and also to destroy some of your best ideas over time. But I think it's okay to have a good idea last year and still think it's a good idea this year. I think
mhm,
especially if you're a long-term investor, if every good idea that you have is a bad one the next year, it's probably not. It hasn't been that good of an idea to
mhm,
begin with. So that would have been a quote I do not totally agree with, but the one you just mentioned, I think it makes total sense, and I think to generally see both sides of the argument, it's a lot more difficult than people would imagine. I
mhm,
mean, I like to read a lot about psychology, and I took classes on psychology as well, and it's a lot more difficult than you would say. It's easy to think that you see both sides, but especially on some investments. I mean, I don't know if you know that, but I have been, or I am, a big shareholder. Not a big shareholder, but it's a big position in my portfolio, especially now in Alibaba. And
mhm,
Alibaba is a company in my mind where you could make perfectly fine arguments on both sides for either not owning it or own it. And I think it's hard to actually see investments from both sides as well as other arguments. But generally, I totally agree with the quote.
mhm. And so, can you tell us like a personal experience of one idea that you thought it was like, wow, great idea, and you had to destroy it because you realized that, okay, this isn't as good as I thought.
Oh, that's difficult. Perhaps then I would need to go back to the early start of my investing career. And perhaps then there was a scenario where I thought it would be a good idea, actually a great idea. Now I know it's a beginner's mistake to
Mhm,
invest in a company. Back then it was a biotech company,
mhm,
where I just thought they have a huge tailwind from the industry, right? Because there's a lot of research going on in there in the segment. And I thought if you would just invest in a company like that, it probably has to be a good investment. Nowadays, I would never do the same. And pretty much about a year later, or probably sooner, I realized that just because an industry is growing, it does not mean that the stock is doing well together with the industry. So maybe you could say that's an example, although I would not necessarily call it one of my most beloved ideas, even at the time.
okay, okay, got you. Nice. So we'll move on to the next quote, and
Sure.
obviously Warren Buffett is here. But the three most important words in investing is are margin of safety.
Yeah, I think if you consider yourself a value investor and you would not totally agree with this one, you're probably not that much of a value investor. If I would take the counter argument here, maybe there's an argument to make that at certain times it's okay to not have a margin of safety. Maybe especially if we talk about the age of an investor. I mean, you are young, even younger than I am,
Mhm.
and I think there's an argument to make that you can take calculated risks or even gambles if the asymmetry in an investment is large enough, even though there's not a margin of safety involved. I know that I've have taken maybe one or two investments like that before with very small positions, but still where I felt like if everything goes right, then this will be a huge winner, maybe 4 to 5x in a pretty short amount of time. But if the thesis is not playing out, it's definitely possible you will lose 60 to 70% as well. And I think if
Yeah.
it's a question of position sizing and it's also a question of your age. Sometimes I use the term lifetime income. I don't think
Mhm.
that's a term that is generally used, but what I mean by that is if you're a young investor, you probably still have a very long time horizon going forward and also a long time where you can make or earn money. So if you lose 10% of your portfolio today, but you still have 40 years of income left, then it's probably
Mhm.
not that much compared to all the money you will invest later on.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what I
yeah.
would say.
Yeah, and now that you talked about position sizing, I think the way a young investor or someone that has yet to start working answers that question is pretty different from someone that manages like a closed pool of capital
Sure.
professionally and is already kind of experienced and more older, I guess.
Totally different.
So I'm curious to know how do you think about position sizing yourself? Because I've asked this question to like other investors that, as I said, much older, have like managed like several millions or something, and each person gives me a different answer. So curious to know what's your take.
Well, I will probably not surprise you when I say that I'm pretty much or pretty concentrated in my portfolio,
Mhm.
but it has been one of those points where I argued with myself a lot of times, not necessarily
Mhm.
for my own sake, but you might know that I share my portfolio with my subscribers.
Mhm.
And my subscribers, some of them work in the industry for a long time, some of them are just in their 40s, 50s, maybe even 60s, and some others are the same age that I am. And it's pretty difficult because if you share your portfolio and there might be two positions that currently make up 50% of the entire portfolio,
Mhm.
that's something where I would say I could argue. I mean, you always have to do your own due diligence. And I always say that, but you probably know as well, even if you say that, people will look at your portfolio and they will kind of, there's this this huge term of cloning. And there will be people cloning your portfolio just because you bought those positions.
Yeah.
So I always kind of debated myself, should I share it or not? Because maybe there's someone who's in his 50s and he's cloning my portfolio and then he has two positions making up 50% of it. So I wouldn't recommend that to anyone who's, older than we are. So
Mhm.
personally, to get back to your question, personally I'm in favor of a concentrated portfolio.
So when you say concentrated, like how many positions?
I mean, to be totally honest, I would be fine if it's only 4 positions. I think right now I should have about 8 positions, although two of
Mhm.
them, because they performed pretty well now in the last year, two of them, and they were my biggest positions before as well, they make up 50%, as I just said.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and but I'm okay with that. If I think the fair value is not yet reached, I'm totally okay with having 2 positions that make up that size of my portfolio. As I said, would I recommend it to to other people? Not necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So let's move on to the next quote, and it's also from Warren Buffett. The most important thing to do if you find yourself in a hole is to stop digging.
Well, once again, I totally agree. And there's still the difference between theory and practice, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
just mentioned I
yeah.
just mentioned the Alibaba investment, and I was a bit early on that one. Fortunately, when I started investing in Alibaba, I barely had any money. So I think I bought the first Alibaba stock at a price of about $120.
Mhm.
But as I said, I did not have much money, so I think my average buying price later on has been $75. Now you could have made the argument for a long time um, that I was in a hole and I just didn't stop digging.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
in the
that's
last
true.
couple of months, it kind of changed, and now you could say, well, you're up almost 100%. It was probably the right decision to stay in the stock, but that's what I said before. It's a bit difficult. You have to make your own assessment of an investment or of a company, and then you have to see what the fair value is. And when facts change, you should also change your assessment. But as long as you have the conviction in a certain company, then it's kind of hard to say when are you in a hole and when should you stop digging, right? Other people
Mhm.
probably would have said I was in the hole a year ago with Alibaba. So it's in theory, I would definitely agree with this quote. In practice, it's always a bit more difficult.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great example, and I guess a lot of people can resonate with that because I bet there were a lot of shareholders that couldn't kind of have the same level of conviction of, or didn't do enough research, and they ended up selling, and now they might be regretting it. But yeah, that's another story. So we have another one. The key to investing is not assessing how much an industry is going to affect society or how much it will grow, but rather determining the competitive advantage of any given company, and above all, the durability of that advantage.
Well, this is pretty much in line with what I said before, right? When I
Yeah,
mentioned the biotech
bio.
investment. Well, I couldn't even say now if biotech actually changed a lot in the world, but
Hmm.
there are certainly industries. I think Buffett himself mentioned the car industry once, where he said
Hmm.
everybody knew that cars would change the world, but the only safe bet would have been to go short horses, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you just don't know which car company succeeds. And I mean, maybe if we would want to have a more modern example, I don't know how you feel about this, but when DeepSeek entered the AI space, I think that's kind of a moment now where it's the first time you question how much money should be invested into AI stocks. And you question that because everybody knows AI will change the world. The question is, how profitable will it actually be for companies, and
Mhm.
how much of a competitive advantage can any one of those companies have? So maybe that's a modern sector right now that fits this quote, where you know it will change the world, but you do not yet know if it actually will be a good investment. And those are generally industries where I like to stay away from. It's always nice to have Nvidia in your portfolio, especially over the last couple of years, but
Mhm.
I couldn't actually say where their competitive advantage is. At least I couldn't really understand it. I could know,
Mhm.
or somebody could tell me that their chips are just better than the competition, but I wouldn't actually know why that is. And if I don't know why
Mhm.
that is, I could also not answer if that could change next year. For all the AI companies, I think when ChatGPT came out, and maybe the first 1 or 2 years when it was out, people would have said that the advantage that ChatGPT has is years ahead of any other company, and especially the advantage the US has, for example, compared to China. And then
Yeah.
suddenly DeepSeek was there. Now Alibaba came out with their own model, and it seems like years of an advantage are suddenly just gone. So I cannot say how much or where their competitive advantage lies. And going back to this quote, if you do not know about the durability of that advantage, I would never invest in a company.
And so this is a bit of a speculative question here, but going back to the analogy of the car industry and the horses, who are the horses in this kind of story of AI and all that? So
That's
who would you go short? I mean, I bet you don't short, but just
I,
in like.
I don't short, but it's a great question. I could be. I mean, I do not want to say that Google will go away or anything, but
Mhm.
what I just realized recently when my colleague Sean told me about Reddit. He's a huge fan of the app, and I never used it, but Reddit is actually one of the most Googled terms out there. And so people basically they Google something and then they put Reddit behind it, and then they
Mhm.
land on the app itself later on. And the same with ChatGPT. A couple of months ago, I Googled everything that when I wanted to know anything, I Googled it. Nowadays, I go into ChatGPT and I ask ChatGPT first. And
Mhm.
maybe Google is the company, without saying that Google will not be around in like 10 years, but if I should on the spot think about a company that is probably not a beneficiary of what's happening right now, perhaps it's Google. although there's still like many competitive advantages the company has. So I wouldn't sit here and say, oh, my take is that Google will not be around in 10 years, but maybe they will have a tougher a tougher time going forward than I would have said 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that's a good one. And actually, it's the same for me. I use ChatGPT for everything, and yeah, it used to be Google before,
And
so that's a good one.
usually, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah,
usually I'm a slow adapter. So
yeah,
I know the first people started using ChatGPT like that 2 years ago, but I'm a slow adapter. But if even I do it now, to me personally, that says that probably everyone else is too, and that's not a good thing for Google.
yeah, yeah, yeah. True, true. That's a good one. So the next quote comes from Thomas Henry Darwin, and it says, "Perhaps the most valuable result of all education is the ability to make yourself do the things you have to do when it ought to be done. Whether you like it or not, it's the first lesson that you ought to be learned. And however early a man trainings begins, it is probably the last lesson he learns thoroughly."
Oh, that's a good one. Maybe that's also interesting because we talked about education just before and kind of how
Yeah,
to balance it. Um, I mean, I wouldn't say it describes my studies like 100%, but maybe a bit because oftentimes I felt I don't know how it is for you, but if you are a value investor or if you consider yourself a value investor, you do not necessarily believe in efficient markets. I
hmm
mean, you do know that most of the markets or most of the time markets are efficient, but you mostly focus on the moments where they aren't. And if you're sitting in a finance or an economics class, the base assumption is always that markets are efficient. And if you're
yeah,
already a value investor in your heart, then you're sitting there and you kind of want to say, well, actually, that's not the case, right?
hmm
So sometimes you sit there in class and it feels like you just have to be there, you have to go through it, but you would much rather spend your time looking for opportunities when you know the markets are inefficient. So
yeah,
sometimes it felt like my studies were something I had to go through, and I never thought about not doing it. Right, even when X maybe worked out pretty well and the blog started working out pretty well, I always knew that I will keep on studying and finish all my studies. But this quote might be might be a good point, where sometimes it felt like it was just something I had to do. Maybe it's the same for you. I don't. I hope not, but maybe it is.
yeah. I mean, like, honestly, I never had the experience of having to sit on a finance or economics class. I was always more like in engineering type degrees and courses. So probably I'll have to go through that now that I'm changing degrees. And yeah, I guess I will have to learn this quote in practice and not just by reading it. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool kind of analogy to your own experience. And yeah, honestly, I don't know how well I will do. Probably I will raise my hand and tell the professor that uh yeah, he's not doing he's not saying the what reality actually is. But I'm curious to know, actually, why did you decided to persist in your studies even though you kind of knew that things were going doing well for you, like in Substack and X.
Mhm.
So what was the main motivation for that? Because I guess it wasn't just like, yeah, I don't like this, but I will do it anyway.
Well, maybe we have to go back to the margin of safety.
hmm
It just
Yeah.
felt like having a degree in at in your backhand is kind of the perfect margin of safety, right? And it wasn't like I was sitting at university and I felt like this is not helping me in any way. It's not like that. So I think I
hmm
learned a lot, and you also have to learn certain stuff that might not be applicable in reality one to one, but it's theory and you have to go through it. So I wouldn't say that it's that I would regret studying that subject or in general, not at all. But yeah, generally I would say it's a margin of safety to say you have a
hmm
degree in your backhand, and you can always go back to that. You can always start working in the industry if anything else is not working out. And if you have a Twitter account or a blog, it might work phenomenal for a year or two, but maybe maybe it helps you actually being an investor and then self-employed. I think Buffett once said something very similar, and maybe that's what happened for me because I knew, although my portfolio is concentrated, I wasn't willing to bet on such a concentrated bet to just say I have a Twitter and I have a Substack that's going quite well right now. So that was too much concentration for me. So I thought
Yeah, yeah.
maybe diversifying with having a degree in your backhand is a pretty good idea.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, and it feels like I'm talking to myself because that's the kind of when I say like, oh, I could just go work or something. That's the conversation I have, with myself, and feels like a pretty rational explanation. So, if your professors won't give you an appropriate multidisciplinary approach, if each wants to overuse his own models and underuse the important models in other disciplines, you can correct that folly yourself. Obviously, Charlie Munger, needless to say.
An obvious Charlie Munger quote. That's right. Yeah, I think he's totally right with that. If when I studied, I mostly tried to have as many subjects in different from different kind of viewpoints as possible. So I had some classes on psychology. I took some classes on philosophy, which is kind of a hobby of mine. And then you have economics and finance. So of course, there are a lot of things that you're missing out on. I mean, you do not have physics in there or anything like that, but
Mhm.
generally I try to have as many subjects as possible and then take the models from those subjects, kind of combine them together. I think especially psychology is a huge one. I just mentioned it
Yeah.
before, but investing is so much about your decision making and not so much about math that than people would think. So I totally agree with this quote, and I try to learn even further away in other fields and kind of take what I learn and apply it somewhere else. It's more difficult than you would think. Maybe for someone with the intellect of Charlie Munger, it's not that difficult, but
Mhm.
reading through biology or chemistry and then taking some mental models from there and apply them to investing is not easy to do. But generally, I would totally agree.
Cool. So my next question is actually, um, it's a hard one, so be prepared. And if you had to hold like a portfolio of 5 books forever, so you can only read those 5 books over like until
Wow.
till you die, basically. What would be what those 5 books would be for you?
Wow. That's a phenomenal question, but also very difficult one. Um, you would first need to think about what topics you would want to cover. So I would go, I mean, I'm biased right now and I'm also primed to think in investing terms right now. So I would definitely take an investment book, which is just generally finance. Then I would also take a psychology book. For psychology, I would choose Thinking Fast and Slow. I know
Wow,
that
I'm reading that at the moment.
you do. I
I'm
remember,
rereading actually. Yeah.
yeah, I read it from time to time, and I really like the book. Although I know there are many people out there who say it's too boring or it's too dry,
Mhm.
but I really like it, and it kind of captures everything. If you read that book, you do not need much more reading on that topic in general.
Mhm.
For investing, which one would I take? I would probably take Margin of Safety by Seth
Mhm.
Klarman. I feel like it's kind of like The Intelligent Investor, but it's a bit more concise and a bit more modern. So that's a good one. Well, and now we have to get thinking because now we chose psychology and investing, but 5 books for life should also cover much more than that. So let me think. I said, I like to think. I like to read a lot about philosophy. So maybe I would choose a book in that regard. Um, I'll probably go with Aristotle and his ethics. That's what I would do. It just captures so much. I mean, you could also go for Platon's State, but no, I would go with Aristotle as the third one. And I do not want to be that kind of person, but I might have to blank on the other two. Like,
Okay.
have do you have 5 books like that? Maybe I could use
Actually,
some.
I asked this question because I answered the question for myself, but only for investing. So
That's a bit easier, I would say.
yeah, yeah, that's easier. But first of all, before answering for myself, I would like to say that I just loved how you kind of spoke out your internal process of thinking. You said, well, now I'm primed for thinking about investing. And
Yeah,
then I was thinking, oh, definitely he mastered like thinking fast and slow. And then you talked about it, so it was cool. Because I'm just in that chapter where they're talking about like availability and
yeah,
priming and all that. So it's pretty cool. Well, for investing, I picked Port Charles Almanac. It's definitely my favorite, even though it's not like technical. It's like investment philosophy. Then I really like the essays on Warren Buffett. No, sorry, Warren Buffett shareholder letters.
sure.
So that covers a lot. So I'm
Yeah.
basically cheating already. Then the Nomad partnership
Hmm.
letters, and Joel Greenblatt's class notes.
Yeah.
And fifth is the focused compounding articles. So it's like 10,000 pages.
Yeah.
So that's basically, I think with those five, you're pretty much set.
I think you cover everything. I mean, I used to have a resource page on my Substack where I upload everything that I like to read, and I,
Hmm.
all of those were in there. Like I think I had all writings of Warren Buffett, which was like, I could be wrong, but 40,000 pages. I've like even myself, I didn't go through all of them. Like I would
Hmm.
say it's pretty significant part of them, but not completely all of them. So yeah, for investing, it's pretty easy to get five together. But
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just thinking about two other even topics that you would need to cover if you think about life. So
Yeah, I also didn't answer for life yet. I put it in my like to do list.
yeah,
But probably we can do a part two at some point and,
we'll get back to that.
and yeah, and get back to that. So yeah, but it's cool that we overlap in some of those things. The last quote I have for you is: "No job is inherently stressful. What causes stress is our compulsive reaction to challenging situations." From Sadhguru. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned passion before, and I think once again, passion is like a huge thing. If you have a job that you're not passionate about, I think it will feel stressful a lot quicker than if you're passionate about it. I mean,
Mhm.
once again, there's also the difference between theory and practice. I know that in
Yeah.
theory, you would say it's always about your reaction. No matter what happens to you on the outside, it's always how you react to something that matters. And technically, you could choose to never get stressed. Technically, you could choose to never get angry at anyone. In practice, it's not that easy. So, um, you wanted me to also say if I agree with the quote or not. I would say this time it's maybe 60% agree, 40% not agreeing, because in theory, like I said, it's a clear one. Of course, you should be passionate about it, and you should keep your emotions in check, and then probably you will be a lot less stressed out than otherwise. But it's probably not that easy in reality. I mean, I'm only starting my job now for about 2 weeks, so I haven't had too much stress right now. I mean, you do work quite long, but as I said, it's kind of like the dream, right? Researching
Mhm.
businesses week after week. Except for some deadlines that you might have, it's more of a fun journey than a lot of stress.
Mhm.
And I would hope that for everyone to have a job that they just like so much that even if they sometimes work a bit longer or anything, they just enjoy it so much that more feels like a hobby than anything else.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's great. Honestly, I have no more quotes for you, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'll make sure to drop down below the link of the Warren Buffett, all the writings from Warren Buffett. I'm not sure where you found that. I only have like the compilation of the letters. I don't know if it's the same thing, but
I
yeah.
It just took a quite a lot of time researching. I also compiled all the letters, and then I did a lot of googling. I mean, now it's been like a year that I've compiled it. I couldn't guarantee anymore that's all that Warren Buffett ever has written down, but at least a good amount of it.
Okay, okay. So I'll make sure to drop down below if that's okay for you, and just let me know where people can find you. And I think that's a wrap after that.
Perfect. Thanks.